Good evening, everyone, and I really want to welcome you tonight to our discussion about replacement theory. I welcome you on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Mary Millman. We are co-chairs of the New York City chapter of the ILRAA. Several years ago, we started a yearly Ives in New York City program, bringing ILR faculty to New York City in person. COVID forced us to use Zoom as it does tonight. Our hope is that next year we will have an Ives in New York City program at our Lexington Avenue campus. Tonight, we are tackling a very serious and disturbing subject, hate and violence. So why this program? On May 14th, 2022, a deadly mass shooting took place in Buffalo on Saturday, a beautiful Saturday, at a supermarket. A heavily armed white man traveled to Buffalo specifically to kill Black people. He killed 10 people and posted online a document that made clear he killed Black people because they came from a culture that sought to, quote, ethnically replace my people. Those are his words, not mine. Shortly thereafter, an alumni phone call took place after the Buffalo shooting because we were discussing what was our responsibility to react to this cold-blooded murder of people shopping on a Saturday afternoon. I mentioned replacement theory and reminded everyone of the event that took place on August 11th, 2017, when hundreds of individuals representing anti-Semitic and white supremacy groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia for a Unite the Right rally. The marchers kicked off the event, many wearing swastikas, carrying tiki torches, and chanting, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." A clear reference to me to the Great Replacement Theory. I can give you many examples of white men killing Jews in Pittsburgh in a synagogue, Latinos being killed in a Walmart in Texas to stop, quote, the invasion of Texas. So on this phone call, we decided we needed to educate ourselves about the Great Replacement Theory. What is it? Is it new? What do we need to do? So tonight we decided to explore this with three professors from different disciplines at ILR, each who bring their own approach to this very important question. In alphabetical order, Professor Ileen Devault, she's a labor historian. She teaches classes on labor and working class history. She's the author of two books, Sons and Daughters of Labor and United Apart, Gender and the Rise of Craft Unionism. Her current research involves examining the impact of workers' family status on the workplace and union experiences. In addition to history, we have Professor Tristan Ivory, who's an assistant professor in international comparative labor. He's a sociologist. He is principally concerned in his research with sub-Saharan African geographic, social, and economic mobility. His first research project examined sub-Saharan African migrants in Japan. More recently, he has begun a multi-year, multi-sided longitudinal interview project that will track sub-Saharan middle-class high school and college students as they move forward in their professional careers. Risa Lieberwitz, Professor Lieberwitz, is a professor of labor and employment law, clearly a lawyer. She's also the academic director of the Worker Institute at Cornell. Her publications include articles on academic freedom in the university, as well as articles on labor law, constitutional issues of free speech, due process, and search and seizure in employment settings. Her current research focuses on the corporatization of the university and the implications of these developments for academic freedom. Ongoing research projects include studies of collective bargaining, as well as her looking at faculty governance in higher education. And so this is our group, and I'm going to turn to our panelists. And we are going to do something different tonight than we usually do. We're not going to have long presentations. I'm going to ask a series of questions, and then my hope is that we will have a conversation. I will leave enough time towards the end so that you can put your questions in the Q&A and I will be asking the questions that you have raised. So, Risa, I'd like you to start. What exactly is, from your perspective, replacement theory, and where does it come from?
Great. Thank you so much, Esther, for organizing this important discussion. And thank you, everybody who's here, for coming in the evening to talk about such important issues. So what I want to do is just start with a basic statement of the definition, right? The so-called Great Replacement Theory, also known as replacement theory, is a conspiracy theory that states that non-white people are being brought into the US and into other Western countries to replace whites, and that this is being done as a means of achieving a political agenda. That's a very specific focus on the idea of immigration, and this is used very much as an anti-immigration kind of conspiracy theory. But I think we should view it as more generally a long-standing, unfortunately, long-standing old idea that's been used along with other white supremacist theories to stoke fear and hatred toward an identified other, which I'm doing in air quotes here, and that the other is a threat and can be used as a scapegoat. The other is defined through rhetorical and violent attacks that are anti-immigrant, that are racist, and anti-Semitic, as kind of the three major areas. So what do these kinds of attacks have in common? Well, they are a way of dividing people, and in particular, dividing the working class along racial, national origin, religious, and gendered lines between whites, and particularly white men, and others who wouldn't fit into that category defined as white. Replacement theory and similar racist, xenophobic and anti-Semitic ideas tell white people, and again, in particular, white men, that they are in danger of losing their rightful place, and that they'll lose them to other groups defined racially in terms of Blacks, Latinx, Jews, immigrants. Integral to creating these hostilities and divisions is placing the blame on other groups for the problems that the white working class men who are hearing that they're in danger. So it places the blame on others for the problems that white working class men are experiencing, whether those are problems with low wages, with unemployment, with unsatisfying jobs, with no hope for a good retirement. This is the key to using that theory as an explanation and a justification for taking action against other groups. And so how is this blame and hostility expressed in replacement theory? Well, the National Immigration Forum, I think very helpfully, sets out several iterations of replacement theory used by anti-immigration groups, white supremacists, and others. And that includes a rhetoric of a migrant invasion that has to be stopped before it conquers white America. There's a rhetoric of voter replacement, that particularly immigrants who are brought in will diminish the political influence of white Americans by being used to support usually what would be viewed as a liberal political agenda. And then anti-Semitism is also part of a conspiracy theory that Jews, and in particular, what's described as powerful Jewish elites, are responsible for this replacement plot. And of course, that's the image that we have burned in our memories that Esther referred to in terms of the Charlottesville white nationalists chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." So whose interests are served by replacement theory and related conspiracy theories? Another way of asking this is, whose interests are served by such theories that use conspiracy and lies to create divisions based on race, religion, and immigration status? So in many ways, this is the oldest trick in the book for those in political and economic power to use these kinds of divisions to divide working people from each other. Sowing these divisions keeps working people from coming together to place responsibility on those in power who are responsible for creating, maintaining, and benefiting from deep inequalities of wealth and power. And then this in turn keeps the working class from organizing on the basis of their common interests in good wages and working conditions and in a good quality of life. And that kind of organizing would involve strengthening the labor movement, possibly creating a labor party, and building other social justice organizations. And so this is the oldest trick in the book. It's been used for decade upon decade, but we still should ask, what is new today about this kind of open resurgence of replacement theory and other related theories? And so I'll just take a moment and list some things that I think we should think about in terms of what's new. Number one, it comes after a period of growing and deepening inequalities of wealth and power in the US. These are the sorts of conditions that form a strong foundation for such sort of white supremacist theories. There's also a new widespread use of the rhetoric of white nationalist conspiracy theories. They've become prevalent and even mainstream in some media and among politicians who have either used coded or overt white nationalist rhetoric. This didn't start with Trump, but Trump unleashed that kind of direct, vociferous use of racist and xenophobic attacks. And these are multifaceted theories. These are theories, actually, that are being used in multifaceted ways for campaigns for law and policy regarding voting, immigration, education, and labor rights. And in all these areas, right-wing conspiracy theories are used to justify actions to restrict rights to vote, to restrict immigration, to restrict teaching about racial history, to restrict labor rights to unionize. And then finally, all these actions are being carried out in the context of increased violence motivated by white nationalism. The list of things that we all know about that have occurred, the terrible violence that Esther was identifying in her introduction. So with that foundation, I'll thank you again and turn it back to you, Esther.
Okay, thanks, Risa. Tristan, Risa gave us a history of where we are now, explaining where we are now, but it was very focused on the United States. Is this a United States problem? Is this an international problem? Could you really expand on this in terms of what do we see in other parts of the world?
Well, thank you, Risa. I appreciate the organizing of this very important topic. And I appreciate Risa's introduction, which did a lot of the work for me in terms of clearing a path. So in terms of just being direct, no, this is not solely a US phenomenon. And I see that someone wrote in the Q&A and asked, actually, what were the origins of great replacement theory? And so in general, there are very old strands of this theory, but the sort of first attribution of the theory itself comes actually from a French author who goes by the name of René Camus, who crystallized these ideas back in the late 70s, early 80s, in terms of this idea that that many peoples are going ahead and trying to replace whites from across Europe. And so the interesting point of this is that this is actually a product of a kind of expansion of whiteness. And we see this as someone who teaches race and ethnicity. We've actually seen that whiteness isn't a static concept, right? It changes depending on where people are in time. And this conception of whiteness has grown over time as many white individuals have seen themselves as being under threat from other peoples, people of color in general. And so this consolidation of many people around this conception of a kind of, how should we say, pan racial or pan-ethnic depiction of whiteness is something that's quite new. It's actually pretty much of a post-World War II phenomenon in many different countries. And so there have been many horrific acts committed in terms of this idea of great replacement, but in general, we should actually note that there have been many of terrible acts that have been committed in many other countries. So most notably, the shooting at a number of Muslim mosques in Christchurch in New Zealand, and then the hate crimes perpetrated by Anders Breivik over in Norway. Both of those perpetrators were actually using great replacement rhetoric. And again, so even though this genesis is kind of closer to our time period in terms of this basic idea of great replacement, it's not that new, right? So this actually goes further back in time and further back in the annals of international history as well, to many ideas, particularly ideas about eugenics. And so for people that aren't familiar with eugenics, this was the idea of racial hygiene or idea of selective breeding amongst human beings that said that some human beings were more fit than other human beings, and generally, surprise, surprise, the human beings that were deemed to be unfit were Jews, people of color, people with any sorts of birth defects or deformities. And so this kind of culling of people was consolidated around a number of individuals, but particularly American thinkers, and then a number of French and British thinkers kind of consolidated around these ideas of eugenics. And of course, those ideas kind of had their genesis in the United States and then spread to other parts, to parts of Western Europe, and were then used by the National Socialists under Hitler to exterminate 6 million Jews and 13 million other people, most notably people of color, people that were part of the Romani, all sorts of people that were deemed to be undesirables. And it's the same sort of rhetoric and language that people are using with great replacement or eugenic ideas, that people are undesirable, that they should be wiped out, that they should be eliminated or stopped. And so just to kind of follow up on what Risa was saying, these ideas, they don't have their genesis amongst working class people, even though working class people attach themselves to these ideas a lot of times. They actually have their genesis amongst a number of pseudo-intellectuals or intellectuals that try and dress up hate speech and actually hate actions in terms of scientific terms. But we know now that eugenics is a pseudoscience. It's not real science. It has no basis in reality. And these things of great replacement are also junk science as well. But they're being spread quite liberally. They're being spread amongst a number of people throughout the world. And there's like this coalescence around this idea of whiteness, that actually we're seeing a number of disaffected young men that are moving to parts of Europe, like what's happening right now in Eastern Europe. There's a number of Western white men that have moved there to take up arms. And so we generally think of this as kind of happening around parts of the Middle East and North Africa, but this is also something that's happening around the sort of this idea of a white Christian belt, right? We hear Hungary is being held up as a model of a white Christian nation. People like, here in the United States, Tucker Carlson, he actually went over there and had a week's worth of shows, right? Trying to spread this amongst a kind of conservative audience. And so this thinking is quite broad and quite diffuse. And a number of these folks are talking with each other. And it's actually part of, unfortunately, part of the Western world. And so it doesn't have any borders. And without some consciousness about what's happening and some actions to try and stem its tide, it will keep spreading. So I'll end it there to make sure that we have enough time for the other questions and that we can have some time in Q&A as well.
Listening to you and listening to Risa, I have lots of questions I want to ask, but I'm going to move this along, and then I will have several questions to ask all of you. So, Ileen, you're a labor historian. You also study gender, and these often intersect, but you have a good view of way new waves of immigrants came, questions of anti-union behavior, et cetera. So can you give us a historical context in terms of some of the things, maybe they didn't call it replacement theory then, but the behaviors and the thoughts were the same. So could you give us that context, please?
Sure. Thank you, Esther. And thank you both Tristan and Risa, because I think they've really laid out a wonderful start for our webinar here. I guess what I want to say is this has been going on for a very, very long time. And we see, looking back at US history, we see this happening over and over again, where different groups are identified, as Tristan was suggesting, as not really white, and therefore they are seen as real dangers to the American polity at the time. And when I say this goes way back, I mean, you know, Benjamin Franklin was upset because immigrants were speaking German. That was in the 1780s. That's really back at the beginning of our nation, right? And then when the Irish came, they were seen as non-white and seen as flooding our shores. In California, Chinese were also, they used the rhetoric of these are floods of Chinese coming in. They're going to take all the jobs of unskilled and semi-skilled workers in particular. And it goes on and on like that, so that almost any ethnic group was at some point, when they first started coming, seen as not completely white. And often that was because of cultural differences. So that it was not only that Asians had a slightly different color skin and they ate a lot of rice, which Americans didn't, but then Italians ate this weird stuff called pasta. And that was obviously not American. And they too were going to replace us all. And I think that the place where we see this really clearly is in the 1920s, which is when the eugenics movement was really growing in power in the United States. And it's also when the United States first started having immigration quotas based on nationality. And what's interesting about that is they did it twice. In 1921, they passed emergency immigration quotas where they said, okay, we want the United States to stay basically the same. And so we're going to look at the census of 1910, and we'll set our quotas based on the numbers of people from different countries in 1910. And then a couple of years went by and they realized that wasn't working, because it turned out that by 1910, a lot of Jews had already come to this country, a lot of Italians, a lot of other Southern and Eastern Europeans had already come. And so in 1924, the act that was passed that became a permanent act for quite a while based their quotas not on 1910, but they went back to 1890. And they said, that's the year we're going to use to set our quotas. And it meant that the quotas dropped precipitously from hundreds of people from some groups to tens all of a sudden in just a few years. And that was all done in the name of, we have to have an America that looks the way it looks, that is white and Anglo-Saxon in some way or other. And so this is what we see, you know, as I said, over and over again in US history. We have this odd sort of tradition in the United States of having immigrant groups come in, and then once they become accepted as white, they often become the ones who become as virulently anti-immigrant as the people who oppose their entrance into the country. And it's incredible how often we see this happening, and it happens in all of our national institutions. So it happens in politics. It happens even in the union movement for a long time. It happens in industry. Actually, industrialists were pretty good. They wanted as many different workers as possible, and they liked being able to play them off against each other. So we see a lot of different impacts of this same basic idea, sort of the old wine in new bottles idea. throughout US history. Is that enough for now?
I think so, Ileen. Thank you. We're getting some really good questions coming in on the Q&A, but a couple of things I want to cover, and then we'll intersperse with questions from the Q&A and things that I want to make sure we get out. Could we talk about the internet? One of the things that we know after the shooter in Buffalo had posted his diatribe, I'll call it, on the internet about replacement theory. What role, nationally and internationally, does the internet play here in terms of spreading replacement theory, the conspiracies about replacement theory? Anyone? Tristan?
Yeah, so I can start off with a slightly condensed answer here. I think it just makes the ideas much easier to spread, whereas beforehand, you had to have a physical copy of something to read. You had to have some sort of place to gather where people would like talk about these ideas, because again, pseudo-intellectual, you'd have these pseudo-intellectual salons or like groups of people that were devoted towards talking about these issues and doing something about them. But now, you can sit in the comfort of your own home and access corners of the internet where people are chatting about these things. And that's how people are getting radicalized at this point. Again, I can't stress enough that in the United States, there was this rhetoric, especially after the World Trade Center bombings and 9/11, about the radicalization of individuals coming from the Middle East or that were, thinking about this is sort of this a Muslim problem, but this radicalization is something that is actually happening to many people, many young men that are disaffected, that don't see themselves as having a political or social or economic future, and are angry. And they're angry and they want someone to blame, as Risa had mentioned before. And when a lot of these young men have a lot of time, they're generally on the internet, they're generally looking for some sort of explanation. And these kind of profiteers, right, people that are trying to go ahead and gain some sort of either renown or fame, they're looking to go ahead and spread their own ideas. And so it's all variations on a theme. So the core remains the same in many of these screeds, as you said, in many of these shooters, that have actually perpetrated these acts in the name of white nationalism. They've all written some sort of material, and it all comes back to this idea of, again, this great replacement, but it also comes back to this idea of kind of wanting fame or infamy, which I think is the reason why ESTA didn't really try and kind of, recognize these people. And I think we shouldn't try and recognize these people in terms of elevating them into some sort of, infamous folks, but that's what people are after. They're after trying to matter in some sense. And because the internet is so pervasive in many parts of our lives, it actually is a great conduit for a lot of hate speech. And it's hard to tamp down. You shut down one site, two more will appear. There's lots of corners on the internet where people have gotten quite savvy in terms of how to go ahead and make sure that their tracks are fairly well hidden, unless someone after the fact goes ahead and is able to do a lot of the sort of forensic analysis and figure out where people are posting or kind of what sites people are on. And even though some government officials have some idea where some of this chatter is happening, again, because some of these things are kind of associated with a lot of youth, they spring up in different points in time and then they move around. It's just like any other sort of thing that's mostly associated with youth. It changes over time. So once we know kind of where one corner is, that corner is already out of fashion within 5 to 10 years. So I'll end it there and allow some of the other panelists to go ahead and weigh in as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important to remember is goes back to Risa's comment about often this pops up after periods of increased inequality. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. We're in this period where inequality has reached a level, and that's inequality in many different ways, that we haven't seen since the 1880s and 90s. And that's the burning thing. We have all of these, especially young men, young white men, who thought they were going to be improving their situations and gaining better jobs and more money and more of everything. And all of a sudden that feels cut off to them for a lot of different reasons. And their response is to look for somebody to blame. And the easiest people to blame can be found on the internet, where they discover that, yes, it's because of these people of other colors or ethnicities or genders or whatever it is. And so we see that flaring up even more, I think, at this point.
Yeah, can I just pop in too? First, it's just wonderful to listen to my colleagues and learn from them. And it generates a lot of thinking. And so the question about the social media, I think I'm going to pull in another direction as well, the way that Ileen did, which is, number one, a reminder that social media is a tool, and it can be used for very progressive purposes. It can be used for very fascist purposes. It could be used in very many ways. And so, that tool is very powerful, and it has been really powerful, of course, in ways like during the Arab Spring, to get the word out for people. I watch my students organize on and use social media, and I'm just in awe of what they can do, and like organizing for union days and the labor roundtable and such, just to advertise some of the things we're doing right in ILR. But it's a tool. And so I think we can look at it that way, recognize the way it can reinforce, these conspiratorial white supremacist ideas, and then also think about like the way that algorithms are used in that kind of social media to reinforce those ideas and to send even more information to people who will then be reinforced in their false beliefs and lies. And then I just want to tack on to something that Ileen was talking about in terms of the disaffection, the deep inequality that people are experiencing. I think that then relates to our discussion about history and where we are now, which is, thinking about particularly since Reagan and privatization and deregulation and crushing the labor unions, that there's a vacuum in terms of where people organize, which I think we can address. What shall we do is we're going to talk about that, but that something's filling that vacuum, and it's not people coming together as a working class to make demands for fairness and justice and redistribution of wealth and power. But in that vacuum, you see this kind of hatred that's been used for decade upon decade upon decade, and then fueled by things like social media.
Yes. Thank you, all of you. I'm learning from all of you as well. This may seem to be taking you off on a tangent, but I don't think it is. So bear with me. The Dobbs decision taking away a constitutional right for a woman to control her own body. We know that the majority of abortions performed in this country are performed on white women. Is there a relationship? Do you see a relationship between this idea of replacing us and white supremacy and the increasing number of states which are passing anti-abortion legislation and preventing a woman from making choices about her own body?
Yes.
Could you expand on that a little bit, Ileen?
I think misogyny is another thing that runs very deep in our society and many societies. And so part of that is what's operating with the Dobbs decision and all of these attempts to control birth control. But I think on top of that, we also have this fear that, these immigrant groups, these groups we've defined as other, they seem to be reproducing like mad. And somehow white families, in part because since the 1970s, more and more women have entered the workforce. They are not producing enough children. So how do we go back and get white women to have more children? And then we won't be in such danger of being replaced in this way. And that still is just surface. And I think it comes back to all of those young white men who feel disaffected, who don't know where they're going with their lives. And they've got these women who may have better jobs than they do, and well, that's not fair at all. So it's a lot of different things all piled on top of this.
I would just do one tag on that, which is, it's the attempt to roll back the clock in various ways, and looking at with nostalgia, I think, at the halcyon days of when women, meaning white women, were at home taking care of hearth and home, recognizing that the male breadwinner was the king of the castle. And so the control of reproduction and women's reproductive choices, again, this is an old story, but this is, a desire to be regressive in that way, to bring back those good old days of the ideal white male worker, who, of course, was not benefiting from that system in terms of a class basis any more than they're benefiting now. And so it's the same way of drawing wedges, putting wedges that are based on race, based on gender, based on religion, national origin, to keep control over those who serve the interests of the powerful.
So 2 quick things to just echo the sentiments of my colleagues is that this kind of imagined past that Risa is talking about is just that, it's imagined. Women have always been working, right? And that's this kind of idea about a middle class kind of conception that is a small fraction of the number of people. And so the idea is that this is an imagined past that never existed, that people are trying to go back to because the sort of gains that are happening socially, again, to echo what Ileen had said earlier, it makes them feel vulnerable. It makes them feel like there's a loss. We call that engraved entitlement within the social sciences, that people feel like they're entitled to something. And when they don't feel like they're getting it, they get disaffected, mad, want to go backwards in time. And this, like, conservative, and I say that with a big C, not a small c in terms of like an American political constellation, but this idea of kind of wanting to regress to the past or keep things in the past. This is something that you can see in many societies. So again, the United States has no provenance over what's happening here. You see this kind of ideology and these trends in terms of trying to prevent, especially people who are disempowered or underrepresented, from actually having their rights in society. And there's lots of different ways in which this is said, but it's kind of all, again, it's one of the older tools in the toolkit in terms of trying to go ahead and beat back progress or strip people of rights.
Yes. So you talked about the past and this glorified past of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, all those programs, which had mom in her nice apron waiting for dad to come home. But there's another past that we seem to be avoiding. And I'd like for all of you to talk about that past. We seem to have a problem teaching real American history in our country. We don't want children to learn about our history of slavery. We don't want children to learn anything they learn about Martin Luther King is he gave a speech and that was it. And the civil rights movement was great, but in terms of really teaching about the history of this country, our adults and students coming out of school are woefully unprepared. Is there a relationship between this lack of knowledge about what our history is and the ability of these conspiracy theories to grow?
So I can lead off with that. So there's a problem that's longstanding with Americans coming out of the school system with sort of an ahistoric view of the world. But what I want to do is focus more on the recent past in terms of the very recent times with regard to the last few years or so, where state legislatures are either proposing or passing laws that specifically prohibit either K through 12 or now a trend in the last year or so, higher education, public higher education, all of this is in public education regulation, to restrict or outright prohibit teaching about race, racism, and racial history of the United States in particular ways. And I think this is directly related to these conspiracy theories. Not only does it attempt to scrub the US of its past racism and racial history by denying its existence and keeping people from teaching truthfully about it, but these statutes create an inversion from a white supremacist standpoint, because a lot of these statutes use what they call divisive concepts to say that certain so-called divisive concepts cannot be taught in the schools, or nobody can be required to agree to certain divisive concepts. And those can include things like that children shouldn't be made to feel guilty about racism that's existed in the United States, right? But basically white people aren't responsible or shouldn't be called responsible for the legacy of the past, and that current conditions are not systemic racism, these sorts of divisive concepts. Now, of course, they're divisive from the standpoint of kind of a white vision of how the world should be viewed, but they're also being used to rewrite history and to rewrite it in a way that shifts the notion of harm from those who've historically been the subject of discrimination. And of course, coming out of slavery, it shifts that harm to those who are historically the target of discrimination and inequality to saying, no, it's the harm to white children that has to be avoided because learning about this will make them feel guilty and will be divisive. So I want to put that out there because I think there's a direct relationship here. And obviously those are problems, those statutes, and they are being challenged in the courts as violating the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause in terms of denying the ability of teachers to teach, their academic freedom, denying children's ability to learn and hear about the reality of history, and of course being viewpoint discrimination.
So speaking about history, we have a question from the audience. Loving this conversation, this person says, so I thought you'd all like to know that. But the question is, how does replacement theory address the fact that white settlers replaced indigenous people when we came to this shores of this country? So that is also part of our history. How does this fit together? Tristan, I see that you've unmuted.
Yeah, it conveniently doesn't address that. And that's a reason why, because this is an idea that there was nothing before, the white settlers showed up on the United States, which is categorically false, right? We've been able to, through historical record, through excavation of archaeology, show that there were quite vibrant societies all throughout Mesoamerica. But it's always easier to kind of justify exterminating people if you can say that there's nothing worth actually noting that those people have done. And that's a very old playbook as well. This idea of settler colonialism isn't something that the United States has a province on. It's happened in a lot of places around the global South, and it has a long history. But the problem is, it goes back to the question that you asked before, is that people in the United States are very historically amnesiac in a way that actually allows for our current political moment to fester. And so the perhaps one of the most disturbing developments for me in terms of the current political moment is just a fact-free environment, right? And this is part of the reason why a lot of conspiracy theories are allowed to, to grow. We saw that with the with the coronavirus pandemic, is that because people were very, how should we say, poor at adjudicating between facts and reality, they were able to live in a kind of fact-free bubble. And I think that this is probably the most daunting challenge that we have as society, is to get back to a point in which we actually can learn history, learn facts as they are and exist on the ground, and have a consensus about the things that did happen and the things that are happening, because unless we actually can come to some sort of consensus, it's going to be really hard to solve the real problems that we have in this country and the problems that we have going forward. So yes, just as a, too long, didn't read or didn't listen, yeah, they're not addressing the fact that this land was actually forcibly stolen from a lot of Native peoples, because that's part of the whole script. The script is to deny people humanity, deny the fact that other peoples actually have legitimate cultures that should be respected, and only think that one culture, this white culture, this Eurocentric culture, is the only culture that matters.
It's easy. Yes, I agree, Ileen. It's easy if you think they're subhuman, right? I mean, that's what we do. We say that they're lessers. So they're lessers, you can do what you want to do to them. One of the questions in the Q&A asks us about how is this issue of conspiracy and replacement theory used differently by the left and by the right. How is this coming into our political discourse, whether looking at it differently as how the right may use it and how the left may use it? Interesting question. Risa.
Well, I mean, I'll start it out. I think that if I'm hearing the question correctly, I think there may be a problems of sort of a false equivalence that occurs in discussions, which is that, well, the right does this and the left does this kind of thing, but I may not be understanding the question correctly. So what I think for me is the best way to consider it is to say, is there, if we're talking about replacement theory, if we're talking about these kind of conspiracy theories, then is the content of it strictly a right-wing white supremacist content? And I think the answer is yes. Not I think. The answer is yes. The history of this situation tells us that this is a tool that's used to keep people from joining together to work towards a society that's based on a distribution that's more equal, that's more fair, in which everybody can have a good life. We've seen too many times in the US and internationally the way that replacement theory and its ilk have been used to exploit those who are told that they're losing out, and to get those who are told they're losing out to turn against others with whom they could join. So I think this is in and of itself an approach that has to be called out for what it is, and that those of us who are on the left, anywhere on that spectrum, one places oneself, or even middling on a political spectrum, need to recognize just how extreme this position is on a political spectrum. And it's become mainstream because of the way in which, between coded language and overt use of it on the right, it has now taken its place on a political spectrum that has now shifted the center to the right. So it seems to me that on the left, our job is to call it out, to fight against it, and to organize. And I hope we do talk more about how to organize.
Let's talk about the workplace for a few minutes. You just mentioned organize. Let's talk about the workplace. I don't know if fascinated is the right word to use, but whenever I turn, somebody is offering a class on diversity, inclusion, equity, diversity at the workplace. I turn on the television and I hear much of what we have been discussing at demonstrations coming from politicians. So could we, since we are the ILR school, could we talk a little bit about the workplace and how do each of you see this playing out in terms of what's happening, whether it's union organizing or it's other behaviors at the workplace? How is it manifesting itself? Not everybody's doing a DE&I program, and yet this is a growing issue in our country, and it seems to have no boundaries.
That's a big question, Esther. And I think part of the answer is that, yes, more and more companies are doing DEI programs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing them well or that people are taking them seriously. And often I think when those things aren't done well and aren't taken seriously, I think that adds to more of that disaffection of white men. And so they then reject everything they're hearing instead of saying, well, wait, some of this may be useful, may be relevant to my experience as well. They just say, this is all bull, and I refuse to listen to any of it now. And those hardening of stances, I think we see more and more all the time.
I got stuff to say about it too, but Tristan, do you have stuff you want to say first?
Yeah, sure. I think that the issues are that in a lot of these DEI programs are basically just window dressing that allow organizations to, and excuse my language, but cover your own ass, right? So if stuff actually hits the wall, the organization can wash their hands of what's happening and then put out a nice statement saying that, you know, they condemn the language without really doing anything to actually manifest change. And as we know, that requires lots of difficult conversations. And I think that a number of people in positions of power within organizations just aren't prepared to have those conversations in a real way, or to actually put forth the resources in order to kind of deal with the inevitable like negative or fallout, right? And that's the problem with capitalism. You know, unless you're generating profits, you know, you're not doing it right. And so when things become more enmeshed in this kind of capitalist thinking, that's the sort of thing that happens. So in some ways, again, there needs to be people that are actually taking the lead to bring people in and to get people to understand the stakes as they are, and to talk about real solutions, which I think both Ileen and Risa have talked about before, which is actually building coalitions, starting to think about common interest, common goals. And I think those common interest and common goals are pretty universal. People want to be able to take care of their families. People want to be able to have some sort of a good future for themselves and for the generations that are coming after them. It's not difficult, but we tend to make it difficult again because there is an entrenched interest that, again, as people have said before on the panel, have a vested interest in those divisions. But this coalition building has been done. It's been done locally. It's being done. And so I think we need to spend much more time highlighting the positive examples of where this is being done and being done right, and actually start to do that in much more earnest. But again, there's an entrenched interest that doesn't want that. And so the problem is that if you just had to fight one battle, that's one thing, but you have to fight the counter battles as well. And that makes the job incredibly difficult.
Yeah, just to follow up real quick, On the DEI issue, in terms of the superficiality that Ileen and Tristan have both identified, it's this sort of marketing tool that of public relations that oftentimes is carried with a DEI notion, inclusion in what, right? I mean, and so if it's disconnected from a notion of distribution of wealth and power in a society, dare I say democracy, a real democratic existence in the workplace as well as in politics, then it's simply counting heads and it's opening markets. And so I think that is why we have to connect it, as Tristan did, to a notion of economic interest and capitalism, and to say the labor movement is the place to look for ways in which people can come together in a multiracial labor movement, in a multi-ethnic racial labor movement, in one that welcomes immigrants, in one that is in favor of class-based and racial and gender-based equality. And we're certainly seeing an increase in organizing all around us in places that people didn't expect to see. And I think it's that power that is a hopeful and optimistic and really a joyful way of fighting back against hatred by joining together across lines that people are telling workers they shouldn't join across.
Yeah, and if I can just add quickly to that, I think what we've forgotten, because unions represent such a small portion of the workforce now. Back in the 50s, in the wonderful 50s that everybody wants to return to, a third of all US workers were in unions. And at that time, the other line that unions crossed were political lines. So that unions, if you were in a union, you had to get along not only with people of different races and genders, but you also had to get along with people who had different political opinions. And we no longer have a major institution that a third of us belong to that has that sort of overriding, we have to all be unified idea. And I think that's a huge loss.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that. You know, in sociology, we talk about homophily, this tendency for people to kind of to attract like to like, and it's getting worse. And unfortunately, it's something that I tell a lot of my students is that the worst lines is education, right? So people with college degrees tend to sort of cluster up, and you see this echo chambering where people are only getting the same sort of information. There's no countervailing information. And we can see this happening across the board. There's a tendency for people to think that racial communities are pretty homogenous, but even amongst racial communities, there's been this kind of winnowing in terms of class or socioeconomic class lines. It used to be through the dint of housing discrimination being so virulent that Black communities were pretty like multi-class, had different positions, but we're starting to see very different clusterings of like Black, Latinx, like Native American communities. And I think, as Ileen said, we all suffer when we don't actually interact with people who are different from us and that have different opinions and beliefs and have to get along with them. That's the part about sharing a society. And again, the reasons why people were doing that in the past weren't necessarily all like good, but it happened. That's the thing, and it's not happening now.
We talked about institutions a minute ago. I'd like to expand that. There seems to be a problem in this country that institutions have lost, and I'm asking you to take a look at the way people view institutions and the Great Replacement theory, but in general, there is a lack of belief in government, in that you're going to get the truth from government, that you're going to get the truth from journalists, that there are no real facts anymore. And so how does the fact that institutions, whether we're talking about schools, government, religious institutions, unions, that we've lost, it seems to me, that sort of institutional framework where people believe that somehow things were moving forward. How do you think this lack of belief in government and other of our institutions are impacting great this conspiracy that white men feel that they are left behind and they have no other choice but to try to eliminate the other. Somebody?
Well, I'll start. I mean, this is a big discussion, right? But where I'll start is more recently than we could start. But I'll start with the 1980s and the Reagan era. I mean, problems of contradictions between, political democracy and an economic capitalist system. Those contradictions are part of, liberalism. And they're ones that the US has lived with, basically from industrialization on in terms of developing those contradictions. So I'm not saying that this started in the 1980s, but the 1980s is when the term neoliberalism starts to be used as a particular raw kind of market worship, which comes along with and romanticizing the market as a private entity that should simply carry on itself. Now, of course, that's a fiction. It's developed, the market is created and supported by the government, right? But of course, Reagan's rhetoric around big government being bad, got to get rid of regulation, we have to have privatization, all of that was used as an excuse for doing even more redistribution of wealth and power to capitalists, not by getting rid of the government, but having the government actually serve the interests, the economic interests of the rich and powerful businesses. And so it was a kind of like capitalism on steroids, as compared certainly to capitalist countries in Europe, which had adopted many socialist policies. So an already contradictory system and a weak welfare state became even weaker along these lines of individualist ideology and neoliberal worship of the market. So that looks like government failure, right? Because it is. Government success is government taking on the responsibility to say, how do we build, going to your question, institutions, political institutions? How do we support civic institutions? How do we support labor unions? How do we support education? All of these as essential for the public good and in the public interest, so that those institutions can be healthy, resilient institutions that pass along norms of democratic life, of a good life for everybody, that really meets a democratic ideal, as opposed to saying we live in a democracy that actually serves economic interests. I'll stop there.
Tristan, do you have something to add?
Well, no, just that we definitely need to, I just echo Risa's points, actually. That's the only thing that I wanted to add in this situation, to be honest. You're muted.
Let me take us back to the workplace. So what can we do at the workplace? And how do we deal with these issues at the workplace or in the community? Someone wrote that, in fact, journalists seem not to want to call something a hate crime. We have at the workplace all sorts of microaggressions. We have hate coming up in the workplace in many different ways. How do we deal with it at the workplace? You mentioned union organizing, Risa, and having institutions where people have to get together and know each other and work together. How do we deal with this both? How do we organize that way? But also, how do we deal at the workplace with these issues of hate and of looking at someone and saying, they're not as good as me? Or white men are being held back at the workplace, which is what I hear all the time. Thoughts about how do we handle this in the workplace. Tristan.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in there. I think that I'll go ahead and explain it in a simple way. You have to be sincere and you have to kind of love and want to serve people. And that's really the only way to do it. I think it's pretty consistent in terms of looking at different philosophies or different actions of people that have been very effective in terms of actually creating real and lasting change. And it's been out of a notion of love, which is difficult because the moment that we're in is a pretty dark moment, and it's kind of feeding off of a lot of negativity. If you're watching TV now for these political ads, it's just attack ads. That's basically what you're seeing. You don't see any positive thing being said about any candidate. I think those commercials are maybe about 5% of all political ads at this point. And so it's very easy to kind of tap into this negativity and to just let it overwhelm us or to have us shut down. But again, I think that's in the service of the power interests that are actually existing right now. If you shut down, if you don't do anything, and things continue apace. I think from the previous political administration, it was pretty good to folks that were still in power, and I think that's one of the reasons why a number of people didn't necessarily speak up, even though you heard a lot of rhetoric about people being appalled or disgusted with the direction that things were going, but people didn't speak up because the bottom line was still being, met for them. And so I think until people realize that that there's a deep disservice being done by this sort of negativity and a race to the bottom, and that, in a way, I don't have to agree with you to actually have your interest at heart and want the best for you and your family. And I think that's the thing that helps us to move past some of the things that are personal slights, in terms of, there are many people that I interact with that I'm pretty sure don't like me as a person, for any number of reasons. But that shouldn't let me kind of shut down and then allow things to get even worse. If I want progress, I have to go ahead and have people's best interest at heart and have the majority of people in a context best interest at heart. And sometimes that means that the voices of people that voices are being repressed need to be amplified. Sometimes it means that we need to build common cause, but it just means that you have to come at it from a place of love and understanding and really wanting to hear people. And until we do that, nothing really is going to change.
Risa?
Yeah. So, nothing's going to magically change the situation that we're in, right? We're in a terrible situation right now, with regard to all the things we're talking about, and the kind of really terrifying things that are happening around us politically, and, in terms of the violence, in terms of, all the things that we're talking about. And so I think that we have to recognize that we got here over a long period of time, right? This didn't just happen. And so how do we change things so that we can get to that kind of those sorts of social relations, work relations that Tristan is describing? And we can't do it alone. We have to do it collectively. Right? I think that's clear if anybody's had anything to do with ILR. And so, I'm thinking about the different institutional bodies that need to be revitalized in a way that does genuinely is steeped in democratic values, economically, politically, and socially. And so, number one, what we can do is have public education that teaches the truth. And all the things we were talking about before, and that creates a historical basis. Now, the right wing has had a long view of how to take over school boards and to prohibit teaching through certain books and stuff. So that was also a long game. We have to play a long game if we want to undo that, and to say, how do we make public education sufficiently funded so people don't go to private schools, that they're engaged in the public schools, so that everybody has a right to higher education that's provided free, so that we cut through those divides as well. And that will help to move us to other creating other institutions where people come to that with a background. That's a good education where we're bringing people together in other institutions. We have to change our laws so that people don't have to walk the plank in order to try to form a union. And to have those discussions in the workplace, not one-sided by the employer scaring employees, but bringing unions in and giving them the ability to respond and to have a place at the workplace during organizing campaigns. I mean, the PRO Act, which was passed by the House, not by the Senate, is a good example of ways to make those changes so that it's easy to organize and unionize rather than having to risk your livelihood simply because you want to join with others. And I think it's through those kinds of collective efforts in all our institutions that we have a workplace that reflects those more democratic institutions rather than a workplace that's reflecting an authoritarian kind of approach.
We seem to be, to use your words, lurching towards a more authoritarian approach. We see it happening in Italy. We see other fascist regimes. We see a past president, who seem to idolize strongmen. How do we get the current crop of politicians to stand up for what they say privately, but will not say publicly? And I'm thinking of the rash of anti-Semitic statements that have been made in the last couple of weeks in campaigns and by a past president of the United States. And yet not a whole group of politicians have not come forward to say that that's not acceptable as part of our political system. How do we change the situation so that people feel that they can come forward? We have no ability to change that situation except starting and having the long view, as you say, Risa?
I think, yes, we have to have the long view, Esther. There's no quick fix to any of these problems that we've raised this evening. It's all long and hard, and it has been long and hard throughout our history. And that's the miracle of American democracy and of the United States, is how hard the Constitution is to follow, how hard all of these things are, but we've done it for all of these years. And so you really do have to take, I think, a very long view of what's going on. And it's hard to do because it's scary right now, but I think that's what we have to do.
The man who became Justice Powell wrote a memo. Risa, did you want to say something before I move?
Yeah, I just want to do a quick tag on what Ileen said. I think that, I think that's true. I said it long view, and I agree with Ileen, we have to take it. But I also think that it's really important that we recognize that in that long road, in that long justice is a constant struggle vision, that we have victories, we can create victories that we celebrate, and that we declare victory when they exist rather than, well, that's good, but there's still so much awful stuff happening, or we didn't get everything we wanted. That the victories are what end up organizing as well, because it brings people in to say, yeah, I believe in that too, and I want to join that group. So that it's not only unions, but it's also other social justice organizations, it's civic organizations. And so we have to continue to build that energy that enables us to say it's worth fighting. Because I swing between despair and optimism all the time. And I genuinely believe that people have an enormous capacity for change. And that's why I believe in education so deeply. I think people who don't have jobs, people who are low wage, and this is including the white working class, that's being sold this bill of goods by, replacement theory. People know when they're in bad situations. And I think it's considering how do we organize so that we have these victories along the way where people do cross racial lines and they organize. I mean, the Smithfield plant, taking 12 years to organize is a really good example of the long game, but also a huge victory where people crossed racial and ethnic lines. They crossed immigration lines, they joined together, and that's how they won.
So we have a question from the audience about the fact that we've been spending a lot of time talking about white men. What about the women who have also been spewing forth the great replacement theory and have also been quite good at spreading conspiratorial theories about our elected leaders? What about them? What role do they play? And are they normalizing this even more because they're women? Thoughts? Tristan.
Well, I don't want to step on Ileen's territory here, but I think the idea is that this idea of white womanhood and a kind of fragility of white womanhood has been kind of used quite often to rationalize a lot of things that have been done against people of color and other folks that are non-white. And this isn't, again, there's nothing new here. White women have been implicated in that for quite a while. And so it's not necessarily, I think some people tend to paint it as, oh, look, like women are playing the game that men have played now, like on the same terms. But I mean, this is something that's actually happened quite a while in terms of, if you look at a lot of the, I mean, since we're talking about racialized violence and white supremacy, if you look at the photos of lynching, it's not just men that were there at these lynching photos. It was the whole families were there. If you see a lot of these kind of genocidal acts, we can go back to the the concentration camps. There were women guards that were working there, and so there's this perception that it's men that are like solely responsible for horrific acts in history. But that's simply, again, it's a kind of ironic act of washing away women's roles in history, both positive and negative. And so I think the question is well taken in that, power doesn't have necessarily a gender in some sense, and that it's seductive for many people, and many people will seek ways to go ahead and be empowered in that sense. So that's just my 2 cents.
I would agree with that. And I think that I mean, in a way, it's the definition of false consciousness. And we see it not only with women who are spewing this, but we see it with African Americans who are spewing it. We see it with all sorts of groups that you think, whoa, why are you saying that? It's the same sort of issue, the appeal of power. This is what the powerful are saying. I want to attach myself to the powerful in society, not to those losers down there. These are people who are trying to deny their loserdom.
I would just also add that, the idea of intersectionality is that there isn't a unidimensional way to think about gender and race, national origin, religion, ethnicity, that these are very complex identities they're social constructs. I mean, just as we discussed earlier, and Tristan and Ileen were both talking about the ways in which whiteness were defined, the ways in which not being white, being racial in a certain way were defined. They're historically based, they're socially created, biology is not an issue here. What we're talking about are social dimensions. And so the sort of divisions that are created, the wedges that are created to keep people apart are also ones that take into account the way that race and gender can divide people as they intersect. So that white women are taught to see themselves as superior to women of color. And that's going to be the sort of divide that will then simply use white women who are not in a position of gaining from that to also not cross those lines. Esther, you're muted again.
Sorry, everybody. I apologize. I was just checking to look at some more questions that people had put into the Q&A. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to ask one other question, something I've read, and I've heard people refer to this as the Holy War, that this is the Holy War. Could you comment on that? Is this a holy war? People believe that this is a holy war, Tristan?
Again, the kind of international history here is quite sad and long. So if you think about the Crusades and this kind of crusading language, that's a kind of common feature of this idea of a kind of war or battle between cultures, clash of civilizations. And so this sort of language crops up quite often, especially in the West, as a way of kind of diminishing the humanity of the other and sort of ginning up a lot of ill will. And so it's part of the idea here is that I think going off of what both Risa and Ileen had talked about in a bit, it's this kind of washing away of history such that those who have been oppressing can feel like they've been oppressed. And so the problem here is that when you are seduced by that, you forget exactly what has been done, right? So not all grievances are kind of completely out of left field. And so the tendency, again, with the rhetoric and the kind of anti-Muslim hate that was generated, especially sharply in the wake of 9/11, was why do they hate our freedom? And the thing is that no one should be bombing buildings or anything like that, but there are some legitimate grievances that people have because they know the history of what people have been doing. And so the problem, again, this kind of idea of a holy war or some sort of crusade or something like that, right? It tends to kind of gin up this idea that my side is somehow innocent and I'm just doing the Lord's work, right? And so once you start believing that sort of stuff, you can start to justify any sort of extreme action perpetrated against someone else. And it's just one step removed away from dehumanizing another group of people and then perpetrating unspeakable acts against people that are, your fellow human beings. So I guess those are my 2 cents there. I'm going to shut it down so I can allow people some other time to talk.
Well, I would follow up also to say in terms of the holy war, whose holy war? So, that vision is to pick up on the Crusades and onward, right, is the white Christian nationalist holy war. And it's being used to deny women their rights over their bodies, to decide about their choice, because everybody is told that they have to adopt that same sort of religious vision. But I also want to point out, in terms of going back to the institutions and the failure of our institutions that many people have relied on for democratic rights, is to think about the US Supreme Court and the way in which it has been consistently with the conservative court, and now certainly a supermajority of ultra conservatives on that court, have been privileging religion in a way that's really breaking down the separation between church and state, both in terms of public funding going to religious institutions, including schools, and yet exempting religious organizations from following laws and regulations that are actually quite secular and should apply to everybody. And so the court itself is doing huge damage to a basic First Amendment principle of the separation of church and state by romanticizing a notion of free exercise of religion that simply is being used to impose laws and ideologies on others.
So, Risa, you began to talk about the Supreme Court and religion and separation of church and state. We've spoken a lot about the belief of the supremacy of the white race. And we talked about race is a social construct. There is only one race. from my view, the human race. But we haven't really talked much about this idea that the United States, and we only have a few minutes left, so this sounds like a good place to wrap it up, as a Christian nation. And somehow that it's a white Christian nation. Could each of you just, as a closing, talk for a few moments about what does that mean in replacement theory and in general, that people are saying that we are a white Christian nation?
You want us to do this in just a few moments?
Well,
yes.
yes,
Come on.
I know, but we have a,
I-
I'm sure. Go ahead, Ileen.
I think what it means is these are people who want white Christians to get rid of all of those others. We're back to that discussion of how different groups define the other. And you've got one group that's defining us as white and Christian, and therefore anybody who doesn't fit that is part of other. That's the best I can do shortly.
Tristan?
Yeah, again, I think it just taps into this kind of historic amnesia. Of course, the country was founded by a number of white men, like, coming with a set ideas about who counted as human, but the sort of religious aspect of that was something that they, expressly were trying to make separate from state, because it wasn't separate in the context in which they were leading. And so people have been very disingenuous, again, for the reasons that Risa had mentioned before, in terms of trying to couch it as like this project that was a Christian project. It never was a Christian project. In fact, they knew quite well the dangers of actually mixing church and state. And for people to be disingenuous with that, it just exposes the game that they're playing in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that people can say that and be and that can be accepted by people, yes, it's a white Christian nation, tells you just how far things have gotten in terms of the rhetoric being accepted. And so, our job is to take those things apart as educators, as people who are involved in organizations, and people who are involved in the public sphere in terms of, trying to promote social justice. We've got to take those apart, make those irrelevant, false statements that we don't play into anymore, and go back to those first principles of how to join together across those divisions to actually move forward towards a good society.
You did it. You answered the question and you did it on time. So I want to thank all of you for participating today. Risa, Tristan, and Ileen, it's been a pleasure working with you tonight and working with you as we prepared for tonight. I really want to thank you very much on behalf of the Alumni Association. I could tell from a lot of people just wrote in, thank you. This has been a great discussion. So I think we hit the mark. So thank you all very, very much. And I hope to work with all of you soon on another project. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Esther.
Yep, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Esther,
Bye,
and thank you, everyone, for
coming.